Imagine if you had received a personal invitation to invest $50 in Uber when it was a startup. On IPO day, you could have made $248,250. That same $50 invested in Amazon before it IPO'd could have made you over $7 million. Mike Markula was Apple's first angel investor, and on IPO day, his windfall was already up by 220,552%. But that's when Apple was only worth $1.8 billion. Think about how much Markula's net worth grew as Apple blazed a path to becoming the first $1 trillion company in U.S. history. And without him, iPhones, Apple Watches, iPads, and other devices we use in our daily lives may have never been invented. Look at these surprising returns from these popular startup companies. Some earning 583,264% revenue surges. What would you rather be? The angel investor or the IPO investor? The choice is clear as day. How would you feel if you could lock in a ground floor opportunity in the hottest startups this year that everybody's fighting over? Fortunately, Shark Tank's Robert Herjavec and his team of ultra-successful angel investors are here to help deliver angel deals with life-changing upsides delivered to you on a silver platter. Watch the free video at www.getangelrich.com or click the link in the description to see how you can participate in these potentially lucrative deals before the mainstream even finds out about them. Once again, that's www.getangelrich.com. Welcome once again to Red Pill 78. I am the Corruption Detector, and this is your Red Pill News for Saturday Night Livestream. Want to thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Once again, joining us for the program is Hugo Fugan, author of The Fuddy Hoax. Hugo was with us last week, and tonight is the ultra conclusion of the story of Loretta Fuddy and Barack Obama, basically. So if you'll all remember last week, well, first of all, if you haven't caught last week's show, I highly recommend seeing it for background, because I don't think we're going to be repeating ourselves too much tonight. But we did speak about the kind of the family of Barack Obama, his intelligence ties, and how that led up to the release of the infamous birth certificate. Once again, Hugo, thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate it. I know the audience is really looking forward to what you have to say tonight. Last week when we ended, we were talking about the release of the birth certificate. The birth certificate for me was a really big awakening, if you will, because, I had heard all kinds of things swirling around about Barack Obama. I was quite literally loath to say anything negative about him because I feel like many people, I had been programmed by the mainstream media to think that if I had something negative to say about the first African-American president of the United States, then that would somehow make me prejudiced or a racist or something like that. But after his first term and realizing that he quite literally was not the person that he said he was, the promises that he made never materialized. He actually took our country, much further back than it was previously in terms of race relations and in terms of prosperity. I felt like I was kind of, between a rock and a hard place. I didn't want to have to, come out against somebody without having definitive proof. So then they released the birth certificate. And with my graphic design background, the first thing I did was go directly to the White House website. I downloaded a copy of the birth certificate, and I opened it up in Adobe Photoshop. And I figured, with my logical brain, there's no way that they would be stupid enough to release this unless it was legit. So I opened it up in Photoshop, and lo and behold, there's like 100 layers. And not only that, but it was sloppily put together. You can look at this thing, just look at it with your eyes, and you can see that there is a lot of things wrong with it. So let's pick up from there.
Well, let me just back up just a little bit and give us the reasonable suspicion that is, sure, it hit us on April 27th of 2011 that there's something wrong with this. But our suspicions were already aroused earlier. And you might recall there was a release of it, COLD, the Certificate of Live Birth.
Yes.
And prior to that even, we had the little author's blurb from Acton and Dystel, his publishers or whatever, his author group. And there he was claimed to have been born in Kenya. And in the race with Alan Keyes in 2004 for U.S. Senator from Illinois, there was an apocryphal story that seems not to have a recording that exists anymore about Barack not even having been born in the U.S., a reference to that Acton and Dystal thing. And he says, supposedly, well, I'm not running for president. And Alan Keyes, aha, yeah, right. Well, that seemed to be confirmation, though if there was ever a recording, we don't have it, at least publicly available. But then this Kolb appeared, and there were problems with that. The representation was that his father was African, of African race, for example. And it turns out that close examination of the seal on that particular Kolb was incorrect. It had indicia not being the registrar's seal. So there were problems with that, and it's just one thing after another. Last week we talked about the Social Security number, the Selective Service application, things like that.
I actually would like to touch on the Social Security number briefly, because we kind of breezed past it last week. But you would mention that there were multiple Social Security numbers that were associated with Obama, because I knew about the one.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I knew about the one which was originally registered to a dead man from Connecticut.
Yeah, Bunnell or something.
Yeah.
Harold Bunnell or something like that.
That was it.
That's the one he had been using most recently, but there was evidence of using other ones earlier than that.
Okay.
But one of the things that aroused our suspicion was that his campaign, and even Barry himself, had claimed differently that he was born either in Queens Hospital or Kapiolani. And in fact, we even have articles from newspapers and electronic media that show the claim one or the other, and otherwise identical stories. And they both, for example, came out from the UPI, or even Snopes was burned by this particular thing. That is, they'd claimed the one or the other. But the long and the short is that neither hospital, in fact, no hospital in Hawaii, had any records of his birth at their hospital. So that's obviously a problem. And the Kolb didn't really satisfy that, even though the Kolb has the Kapiolani, which they, no, in fact, it doesn't say Kapiolani there. But anyway, later it did say Kapiolani on his long-form birth certificate. So it didn't really, well, it settled the question of which one they chose, but it didn't solve the issue of why did they ever claim that he was born in Queens. But to pick up the story where I think we were, that is, there was a Republican governor in charge in Hawaii, and that wouldn't do if there were going to be records manipulation, which I believe was very clearly what we saw later. But if a Republican governor was overseeing all of this, it would be a problem. And I think Barry knew that. So one of his first jobs was to get a Democrat governor, and he encouraged Neil Abercrombie, an old friend of his, to do that, to run not any longer for state representative or representative to Congress, but to become the governor if he could. And I believe Barry helped him with his election there. And indeed, that December, he became the governor of Hawaii in 2010. So he had one of the first pieces in place, and the next piece to fall in place would be the director of the Hawaii Department of Health, for whom he wanted Loretta Fuddy. But there was already somebody else who had been nominated, and that person was hastily shown the exit with a snide innuendo about billing irregularities, even though he knew of anything like that. And he even didn't know why he would be resigning or giving up his nomination for that position.
Now, has he spoken publicly about the fact that they forced him out?
Yes, there was a news conference where he would resign. And when he was asked by a reporter, why are you resigning exactly? He said, well, I don't know. And even though there was this smear, frankly, that he supposedly had billing irregularities. Well, he was an MD and had, practice as was actually the the standard for the Hawaii Department of Health director for a long time. That is, it had always been a medical director, a medical doctor who also had another practice and didn't have the necessity to be full-time with that job. But anyway, they got Loretta Fuddy, and this was the way they did it. They got rid of the other guy very hastily and under very suspicious circumstances. Then it fell to Neil Abercrombie, who had made during the campaign a promise that he would produce the Barry Obama birth certificate. And to fulfill that promise, he went high and low in all of the places in Hawaii and turned everything upside down to find that, and had conversations with his friends on how he was doing and so forth. One of them was a radio announcer. The long and the short is he was unable to produce that record, even though the previous Hawaii Department of Health director had said on 2 different occasions that she had seen this record and had represented, for example, that it was half typewritten and half typed. Half typewritten, half handwritten. But even though that representation was there, somehow the governor is unable to find that record. So he must have asked, one would think, this previous director, but somehow she was not able to produce it for him. So the long and the short is he left it to Loretta Fuddy to find, and that was her task. In a few short months, she did that. From January to April, and in April, you might recall, she wrote a letter to Barack Obama. There was a special request, which really involved some change of the policy, which they used to always give out long-form birth certificates, but then they changed the policy as if it was only by special request where they're going to do this. Well, there were some problems with that, and that's what they were trying to cover up, frankly, and they did so by that change in policy. But nonetheless, Barack Obama made the request through his attorney, his private attorney, by the way, also from Pkwy, which is that organization headquartered in Seattle, Washington.
Yeah, it's very familiar.
And is also a registered agent of the Communist Chinese, has been so for, I think, 35 years now or so, and had been run by what was previously Barack Obama's personal attorney, who by the time of his first term was the first White House counsel, that is Bob Bauer. So his underling was Judy Corliss, and she was the one who hand carried the 2 copies of the new long-form birth certificate from Loretta Fuddy to the White House, and made it available then within a couple days to be on television in a special presentation, also to the White House press corps by this Bob Bauer, who also, even though has been a registered representative with his company Pkwy, of the Communist Chinese, he's also deeply involved in the clown category. Yep. Friends of ours, and they presented this certificate then on television, but in the White House press room, they did not allow any cameras to be taking any pictures, which you might imagine the camera optics are so good even 2011 that they didn't want a high-resolution representation of that birth certificate to be taken.
Right.
And we know why, frankly, because there were lots of problems with that birth certificate. In fact, there's evidence of multiple copies. Some say even 3, but probably at least 2. That is, there are variations on the different images that we have available to us. So that's all rather hinky. And furthermore, the seal that was supposedly on that birth certificate appears incomplete, incorrect, not the correct birth certificate. So there's reason to believe that probably after it left the hands of the Hawaiian Department of Health, that it might have been changed or necessarily adjustments made. And we know what those would be, frankly, because there's a lot of evidence to suggest that if that birth certificate were ever shown, it would need to indicate a couple of special stamps for having been amended, for example, or having been included late information. So those are hand stamps that would have appeared, and it would be quite possible, it would be possible to remove those electronically and then put on a new piece of paper, but then you wouldn't have the seal any longer if it came from, even if it came from the Hawaii Department of Health correctly. And that's what is one hypothesis about what might have happened to it. But nonetheless, long and the short is there are so many indicia of forgery, of falsification on that document that even the best document that we have. And the highest resolution version we have is one that came in the White House press corps kit. And it is much higher resolution than the green safety paper version that most of us see. But I try to use that one because it does have the truest representation of something in high resolution. So it has kind of a aqua gray background. You might have seen it.
Yeah, I've got it on screen right now for everyone to see. Now, just as an aside here, the very first thing that I noticed about it was that, well, first they presented it as if it was an original document. But when you look at it, you can clearly see that it's as if they took an original birth certificate and then printed it on a new, like, that safety background, because there's a portion on the side which bends up,
yes,
as if it's coming out of like a book or something like that.
Yeah,
you know,
and the background doesn't bend.
Yes, the background doesn't bend. And then, you know, and then of course, you know, you've got all of these discrepancies. You know, I mean, the like differences in the resolution of the individual letters and numbers, differences in the saturation, digital saturation, not like an original like ink blot or something that, you know, if they needed to refill their ink, it's not because of that. It's because it's clearly a manufactured document. They've taken multiple documents, cut and pasted, and then put it all together and pretended as if it's one that was the original one.
Yes, indeed. And a lot of those problems arose, I think, because of the difference between a grayscale copy and a black and white copy.
Exactly.
You see black and white where if there's anything there, it's solid black. If there's not anything there, it's transparent, goes right to the background. But other areas, other fields, have this subtlety of a gray scale. And for example, with all the pencil markings and so forth. Mm-hmm. But you can't have both of those in a single document. There are no printers even now that, at least under user control, can do simultaneously both a black and white copy and a grayscale copy. So that had to be the result of multiple copy processes, passes, if you will. Mm-hmm. So that's just one of the areas that shows this problem. And there's just no way, just as you say, there's no way. Yeah. But if you want, we can go through several of those. But I think among the people, the experts out there, and even several good amateurs, there have been shown a lot of problems with that document that basically amount to proof that it's a forgery and falsified. And with that as the truth that people were recognizing, I think we should talk about the various things that were coming, bing, 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 one right after the other, in terms of what maybe the White House was doing to make sure this wouldn't be long on the front pages of newspapers, because if this were to be discussed day after day, it could be a problem for the president. There's no question about that. Just as the coal was insufficient, it would be recognized that this would be insufficient.
Right.
And what we had, one of the first things we had just a few days, 3 days after the presentation, there was a White House Correspondents' Dinner where the now President Donald J. Trump, then simply citizen, was present. And he had been on the talk show circuit, you might recall, asking why doesn't he show his birth certificate? Mm-hmm. And there was this big billboard campaign of where is the birth certificate? So this was on a lot of people's minds. There was even a book out that was due out in May on the birth certificate. So there was just lots of focus from various places on this. But what Barack Obama did for the White House Correspondents' Dinner in Washington 3 days after the presentation of that birth certificate was a multimedia extravaganza, and it had Donald Trump in person in the audience, and it pummeled him. That is, Barry pummeled him with verbal assaults, and he had nice Hollywood backgrounds, a video of the Lion King holding up the baby and all this kind of thing, as if now it's all been proved and settled and so forth. And even though we'd been talking about Donald Trump possibly making a run by what he was doing in the media, all of that discussion kind of fell away.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that was very much the plan to cow Donald Trump from going ahead with such plans. Now, we also know in the background that Donald Trump was a mentee, that is, his mentor was President Richard Nixon, and his wife Pat even wrote the Donald a letter at one point saying how wonderful he would be as a president.
Yes.
So that was in a lot of people's minds, maybe not the public's, but it was in various people's minds that it just might come to pass someday that Donald Trump might seek the presidency. No, so I think there was a lot of interest to make sure among the Barry camp that they didn't have a successful contender developing. So they were going to nip that in the bud.
No, I definitely agree. And it, in my opinion, I felt that the whole incident with the birth certificate is what ended Donald Trump's possible presidential run at that time. It could be that President Trump, never actually intended to run in 2012. Perhaps it was always that it was going to be 2016. But do you have any theories as to why people didn't go harder challenging this? It baffled me, number one, that they would release such an obvious forgery. The fact that I could download it and the layers hadn't been compressed. Right there, bingo, that's proof. But also, just any layman looking at this document can tell that it's a forgery. I've always wondered why Donald Trump, at that time, candidate Trump, didn't go after it even more. He did seem to have put a lot of money into that campaign. He was very vocal, and up until the point that they released the birth certificate, he was out there talking about it. And then as soon as this came out, it just dropped. And I was always very surprised by that because it was such an obvious forgery to me.
I think it's always a question of the numbers. That is, Donald certainly knew the truth of the matter, and yet could he honestly say that he had the evidence to say that this was a forgery? It was an uphill battle.
Okay.
And I think it was a sense of the pulse of the electorate, whether he could go forward with that. Probably his supporters as well, financially. That is, he needed to be able to count on the money to run. And if people didn't have confidence in that, if he couldn't boldly say in a challenging way, well, I know the truth, and the truth is this. Well, I don't think at that point the evidence was strong enough in his favor to move forward, and therefore the numbers of the followers were not going to be able to be there at that time. If he had, whatever it was, enough evidence in hand to be able to say, I know the truth is this, here it is, he would have been able to go forward, but he didn't. I was disappointed that he didn't feel he did, but the next thing, pretty much, it took a few months to come out. Well, he must have been born in Hawaii. Well, that was the end of it. It was skidding down to nothing for this term or this election. So I think just it was not a sufficient critical mass. It had to come from a lot of quarters. I think in concert with what Barry was doing in humiliating Donald Trump at that White House Correspondents' Dinner was an ongoing humiliation of what we call, or he's called, the birther effect. That is, birtherism was a pejorative that was still pretty well find traction as ridicule against the right. And what I find so unfortunate in all of that is, well, having been there from the beginning, it was not a claim from the right of any, going beyond the evidence of saying, well, was he born in Kenya or Hawaii? No, it was never that. We were not, that is, the people who were being called birthers only wanted the evidence. They did not make the claim that it was, oh, we know he's born in Kenya, or, we don't think he was born in Hawaii. No, it's the evidence is lacking, and we work on evidence. That's always been our standard, not on some emotional pejorative that we ridicule people with. That's a leftist technique. Exactly. It's not the conservatives. We say, show us the evidence. We want to see the evidence. We see so many pieces of evidence that are contradictory, that are obviously falsehoods, and none of it appears to be true. Right. And yet nobody was able to bring forth, for example, a lawsuit that was able to get at the merits of any of these arguments. They were all just able to be shot down or be told that they didn't have standing. One of those was Alan Keyes, who appeared to me at least, to obviously have standing because he was running against Barack Obama in an election. And but anyway, the long and the short is somehow all of these things were able to be shot down. And one of the big hopes was for 2012 and that presidential election that we could settle this issue on the merits. And there's a lot that's coming up in this story with the verifications of the Barack Obama birth certificate. And there were 3 requested verifications that were particularly 2 state Secretary of States, that is of Arizona, that is Bob Bennett, and Kansas, that was Chris Kobach, and also another case of the Mississippi Democrats against Orly Tates, or Orly Tates was bringing the suit. All 3 of those requested verifications of the long-form birth certificate that Barry had produced. I'm kind of jumping ahead in that story, maybe I shouldn't. But the long and the short is there were falsifications in those verifications as well. And we were running up right into the 2012 election. People were placing their hopes maybe on this, which left and right then were being shot down. That is, the verifications kind of looked good. They looked like they were verifying what Barry's claims were about his having been born in Honolulu and so forth. But the long and the short is those verifications contained indicia of falsehood, of forgery, and no one was able to get behind it quickly enough and make a case out of it and bring it before any court. If they had been able to do that, and there are even now those indicia which should be satisfactory, that is, those verifications do not meet Hawaii administrative policy for verifications of a birth certificate. They're all suspect, not only suspect, they are all imperfect, inappropriate. They are inappropriately sealed and certified by the people that needed to have sealed and certified them. And that was the doing of Loretta Fuddy. That is, she was personally putting her own seal on those verifications, but she did not put her own signature on it. Whenever she puts her own seal on that, she is required by Hawaii statute to have her own signature. Her own signature not being there makes those imperfect. That is, they're false. No. They are not properly certified.
Were they just unsigned, or were other people signing them with her seal?
It should have been signed by the registrar and sealed by the registrar. That could have been okay. Yeah. But the registrar's seal does not appear. It is her seal. And I believe that indicates the registrar was not willing to make the representations that were on that document. Okay. And therefore she took the bull by the horns and put her own seal on it, without putting her own signature on it. And that is a failing that kept those from being properly authorized. So they are not properly authorized, and therefore they're false. So these questions should have come up. Why wouldn't the registrar put his own seal on those documents? All three are imperfect in that way, and they are therefore not according to Hawaii policy. And not being according to policy means they are not valid in a court of law.
And so on the long form birth certificate that we have Alvin T. looks like Onaka. Onaka. So was he the state registrar at this time?
He was at the time. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So
he would have been the right person to do that. Okay. That's his stamp.
Yeah.
That you see. I see to certify this is a true copy and so forth.
Yeah.
That is reasonably his stamp.
Yeah.
And apparently multiple people had control of his stamp, but he had entire control over his seal. Mm-hmm. And so that was his legal absolute backstop against anything coming against him.
Okay.
And so I think that was the thing that was used both by him to withhold and by her to override, but in an imperfect way that made it invalid in a court of law. So if ever those had been presented in a court of law and those arguments had been able to be made, showing very clearly the Hawaii statutes, I mean, those were very clear. They could have put a stop to it, but no one was able to get that far in a court of law. It was contentious with Orly Tates in the Mississippi Democrats suit, and she was apparently able to present merits of the case, but she was thrown out, and some think that she perhaps did so purposely. I'm not here to say that, but that's what some people think. And indeed, if she did have an opportunity, it was a very real opportunity if she had been able to see these things happening in the time she had available. But it didn't turn out that way. But what we saw in other things here, we shouldn't forget the Dennis Montgomery representations that he was hired by Clapper and Brennan to make remote changes into the Hawaii birth and death certificate certification, the database. That was also part of this story. Probably even the Gabby Giffords and Judge Roll assassinations. That probably played a role in all of this.
Dennis Montgomery?
Yeah.
Well, I'm familiar with Dennis Montgomery as a whistleblower, but I had absolutely no idea he had anything to do with this.
Oh, absolutely. He's huge in this. That is, there are variations on the birth index that should never have been possible to print, and yet we have contradictory birth indices that show the one and the other, which only could have happened by changes in the underlying database, none of which had any reason to be made as a change. So that pretty well is the fingerprint of Dennis Montgomery's participation in all of this, and his own representation about what he did or what he was charged to do is simply entirely in sync with that result. So that's part of it. And the other part is that there was no birth certificate number for Barack's birth certificate, and one had to be procured. So there had to be manipulations of the database for that. And we see through multiple outputs from that database that was manipulated as well, and that he took over the birth certificate number of another person to be given one for him. That is, his birth certificate information was in a completely separate place. That is, it was among the invalid, incomplete, inappropriate file. That is, there were the correct ones, the fully valid birth certificates, and then there were those which had some information but incomplete information. For example, it was required that the child's birth weight be given and a doctor's signature and so forth. Well, the belief is, the understanding is that didn't exist for Barry's birth certificate. That it was his certificate amounted to a claim, probably by his grandmother, Toot, that he was born in such and such. That is, the state of the database in 1961 was such that a relative could make claims, and those claims could be taken at some level, but they would be called imperfect or incomplete at some point if they weren't perfected within the year, for example, with the doctor's signature, with the birth weight, and so forth. So the belief is that that was not done in a timely fashion. In fact, there's some evidence, good evidence, to suggest that a lot of that birth certificate information was only completed in the 2000s. That is, a lawyer made representations which are legally acceptable in some sense, but then they would not be prima facie evidence for a legal birth certificate. And therefore, they would be required to have these stamps, which indicate that the information on this birth certificate came late, and therefore they're invalid, literally. So those stamps would be something that the registrar would say, okay, that's all right, because that's what I'm supposed to do. If it's incomplete information from the beginning, they must have these stamps. But those stamps are therefore removable in a computer type process. That is, you can take a photocopy of this and you can simply electronically edit away a stamp that says amended or late, things like that. So I'm going to give the registrar the benefit of the doubt and say that perhaps when he put his stamp on that certificate, it contained those stamps, those flags, if you will. If you look at field 23, evidence for delayed filing or alteration, that's where those stamps would appear. And he would be able to certify on the basis of the presence of those things. But in an electronic form and in a Photoshop kind of way, we understand that that kind of a thing could be easily erased electronically and then reprinted on a fresh green safety paper background without those stamps. And then it would look like it should look, or we would expect it to look. There's just lots of evidence about the lateness of those filings. One of those is, of course, the father's race, the African kind of thing. That, and there's been a lot of statements, people say that back in 1961, that was never the term that one had for an African American. They were called Negroes at that time, and things like that. So one has to understand that somebody must have strongly desired it, because that was a very knowable fact. And so for someone to make the claim nonetheless that his father's race was African, probably had some special interest in doing that. And I might go in that direction, but it's only conjecture, so I won't.
No, why not?
But anyway, no.
I think it'd be interesting.
We've got too many other things to do. One of which is the Star Advertiser microfiche information. That shows tampering as well. That's not a standardly known fact, but there's evidence already of that having been forged. We see these were on microfiche, and the edges of those film pieces have certain markings of who processed it and so forth, and the manufacturer and so forth. Curiously, those markings are entirely different for just those microfiche pages on which Barry's announcement find place. So anyway, things like that. But my research colleague, Butter DeZillion, was very much involved with the Terry Lakin trial as a researcher and provider of information. And this was known to Barry and friends, I'm sure. That is, they were watching, I believe, the legal team make their case, and that was hugely important back in 2010 when Lieutenant Colonel Terry Lakin declined his orders unless he could be shown that they came directly from a validly qualified president. Anyway, that was very much a concern. It shouldn't have been a concern because he should have been a legally qualified president, but he wasn't. And so they didn't want, in a legal setting like the military might be able to provide, that to be able to be plumbed and discovered in a legal way. So they had to mess with that process. So one of the ways they messed with that process, well, I believe, was the judge, but we'll leave it at that. The long and the short is my research colleague was taken note of, and in a later chapter of the story, she and her family, I believe, were attacked, and they are still suffering under that circumstance.
Really?
Yeah, it's
not surprised.
It's been life-threatening. No one has died yet, but nonetheless, a hale and hearty 53-year-old Lutheran preacher is on the level of an infant at this point with his mental faculties and everything else.
Oh, good Lord.
So he, through poisoning, was brought low, I believe, and that was threatened. It was threatened beforehand, and that threat was carried out. That's how I understand that.
Wow.
And I believe these people are serious.
Oh, yeah.
They have been serious about it for a long time. But nonetheless, we're not cowed. She's not cowed. I'm not cowed. And we're taking this forward. And before we get too long, I suppose I should know, maybe we're not running out of time just yet, are
No,
we? Not
at all. We've only been on for 43 minutes, and we've got up to 2 hours.
Okay. Well, I better get going nonetheless, because it's still lots to do. Okay. Well, let's see. After the White House Correspondents' Dinner, we had, you might recall, Osama bin Laden just a few days later.
Yep.
May 2nd or so. He was supposedly taken out, but the long and the short is he was already dead.
Right.
So for Barry to play that hand was very much a calculated thing to get him off the front page. That is, get himself off the front page.
Yes.
With regard to these shortcomings of his birth certificate. And he would do so by even going after somebody who didn't exist anymore. And all of that was this Pakistani thing. And there's a whole chapter I'll leave out of this story, but I'll just mention it in reference. What else? Have we ever heard of Pakistan here anywhere else? Like maybe Barack Obama having gone to Pakistan at some point?
Yes, yes.
How about the Awans who come from Pakistan,
yeah.
who all of a sudden have this unusual access in Congress?
Mm-hmm.
How about ISI and all of that?
Yeah. 111.
Yeah. And the fact that this is all a ruse. He's dead.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then what happens? Well, probably wasn't appropriate that the SEAL Team 6 be referred to.
By Joe Biden.
They were pointed to very openly, which never should have happened. Was that Biden?
That was Biden that did that.
Yeah, Biden. Say it louder. Biden said that. Put them on the hot seat. Put little targets on all their back. Far more effectively than Sarah Palin ever could have put target on anybody's back.
Yep.
But nonetheless, then August 6th of that year, 2011, extortion 17. And what was it, 38 some people lost their lives that night.
Yep.
Under the most unusual, under the most inappropriate circumstances. That mission never should have happened with that equipment, never should have, whatever. You might know the name Lieutenant or Captain Joni Marquez, who was in control of the firepower at that point, but was restrained by her Pentagon folk. The long and the short is these are related things, and it's extremely inappropriate that I think is a direct result of the machinations that were undertaken by an inappropriate, unqualified president.
I have to agree. I have to agree.
Need to break with that and kind of go on to this circumstance here. We have 2011 Fuddy procuring, I'll say this, falsified, forged birth certificate. In 2012, she's providing verifications. She's sitting there probably hoping against all hope that nobody gets to look at the merits of this case, because she would probably be brought in front of the court. Fortunately for her, that never came to pass, but it could have, left and right, if things had gone just a little differently. And there's a lot to be said in that category, but it's water under the dam at this point. But the long and the short is, it was time, I'm sure, her interest would be to escape from the real world and to retire. She was certainly of retirement age, and she would want to do that. So this circumstance came about in the middle of the Hawaiian island chain. There's a very remote island there, Molokai, which has a very remote peninsula on its northern side where there's an isolated leper colony that is called Kalaupapa. And this area is very secluded. You can only get to it either by boat or by airplane or by mule. And it certainly would have been the circumstance or the place where various scenarios of clandestine operations would have been planned around that. That is, when you have a limited circumstance, set of eyes, that is, you don't have the media, you don't have camera. Nobody stays overnight, by the way, except under special circumstances when they're friends of people who work there and so forth. So you don't have prying eyes of the media. That's a ripe opportunity for what we already know is the case. That is, people from a clown background are involved in this story, left, right, up and down, and they're going to be involved in this situation. And what's unique about this particular one is the number of different agencies and people and highly placed officials of the government who are participating in this particular exercise, if you will. I believe it started out as some clandestine plan that was pulled off a shelf. We could do this, we could do something with an airplane if we ever needed to, and it developed into a real big plan where Loretta Fuddy, who was the nominal mayor of this Kalaupapa town, if you will, village, where there was a dwindling number of lepers, where she was that mayor who made a visit at least once a year, and this would be it. She would be given an opportunity to leave the real world, that is, in the clown vernacular, to exit to Valhalla. But what this circumstance then afforded was something like a witness protection program, which, by the way, is a statute even in the Hawaii revised statutes. I think it's 28-101. That is, if the Hawaii Attorney General determines that someone, a potential witness to a court process that needs protection or is in danger, he can spend the money, do whatever, and that's the key, do whatever to protect such a witness or potential witness. So I think that was a loophole, a verbiage which afforded him the ability to spend all kinds of money and do literally anything, whether legal or not, to let this scenario play out. And what they did was a very full-blown scenario. It's incredible how they overplayed their hand with this particular scenario. That is, they could have had her just trip on a whatever and eventually, after 2 days in the hospital, succumb to an infection or something. But no, we have on this particular island present the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Marine, Navy and Marine Corps together, but the U.S. Coast Guard, the NTSB, the FAA, the Maui County Police, the Maui County Fire Department, representatives, Hawaii State Government, local organizations as well, the coroner, the medical examiner for Hawaii, or for at least that area of Maui and Molokai. And so all of these agencies are brought together to participate and to literally spend every energy they could to falsify and change the record on what really happened. And that's an incredible set of circumstances. We looked at all of these organizations, and not one of them plays it straight up. Every last one of them is spending some time and effort to falsify the record. So that's just incredible. And it starts with none other than a CIA-assigned submarine worth over $2 billion and under the control of John Brennan himself. As the director, he would have had to sign for a clandestine operation to take place. So we know that must have taken place, even though we don't have that signature. But we know that La Jolla submarine, the USS La Jolla, was assigned to the CIA, and that it participated in this. And I was told when I explained this scenario online to the public, I was confronted by one of the passengers who quickly said, "Poppycock." Well, that's quite something. And if we look at the meme number 9 of your memes there, we can pull up some circumstances about this. That is, there was one of the passengers took video of essentially the entire takeoff and descent into the water and aftermath on the water of this exercise. And things are captured in his video that I suspect probably weren't intended to be captured, but probably couldn't have been removed successfully either. Maybe if they'd done a little better editing, they could have done that. But if you're looking at page or plate number 9,
yes,
this is poppycock. That is, these things could not have occurred. And we call that little green slip and slide against the side of the airplane there. Mm-hmm. That's poppycock, Mr. Passenger. That is, that could not have appeared if this were not a clandestine operation by the clowns. That we have been told by someone who is very close to all of this and knows what things are. That's there's probably a better vernacular, but underwater demolition transport vehicle. That is, that's a vehicle that gets SEAL type or military trained divers to their location, usually underwater. And this one became unbalanced and popped above the surface and was captured on the videographer's tape there, or recording, computer recording, if you will. Okay. So that simply cannot be there unless all of this is true, or at least the things we can further prove. But it further shows that there were trained military divers on the scenario, and some of them there in the lower right there probably captured literally a couple of figures there, one holding his hand on that vehicle, another one swimming away from it. Okay. But nonetheless, we see it elsewhere as well in the upper 2 images. That's atop the starboard wing, that is the right wing. This is a mechanical device of some weight. It's being placed, it has been placed above the right wing, and it's being unfolded, as you see, from left to right. And I believe that contains some, probably some saw type equipment that would allow divers to saw away the engine from the airframe. There's a number of good reasons I say that. The long and the short is the airplane was the airplane's engine was taken off, and another airplane engine was thrown onto the ocean floor and dredged up a week later, as if it had been the engine that came off the airplane. They said it was separated by the winds and the waves and on the bottom of the ocean floor. But with the saw cuts that we'll see shortly, that's absolutely impossible and shown to be a lie.
So would that be the engine that we see in this picture right here? Is that an engine? It looks like a propeller.
That's an engine that left there, the upper third left. That's the engine that indeed went down with the airplane.
Okay.
And you can take note of the propeller blade tip paint pattern there, kind of a white two-part thing with a black stripe, fairly thin black stripe down. That'll become relevant later.
Okay.
But as long as we're onto that, we can look at one of the other plates. Yeah, 24 is probably the quickest way to do that. Now, the NTSB represented that the airframe was fragmented into numerous pieces, which were crushed and battered in a manner consistent with being rolled over on a hard, uneven surface by wave action. But if you look at those the ends of those arrows, you see that those are saw cuts at the ends of those metal pieces.
They're remarkably
and
clean.
Not something that happened by the winds and the waves underwater. They're clearly saw cuts. I mean, you got a big heavy pipe that supports a 1,200-pound engine, and it's not wiggled back and forth 300 times to fatigue and break. No, it is saw cut. And piece after piece is that way. If you look at the upper right picture there with the firewall in the background, all those pieces are saw cut. They are so clean, and not totally clean, but they were not wiggled back and forth until they broke. They were saw cut. The ones in the middle and the upper right are just absolutely clearly of that nature.
Yeah.
And the hoses as well. In the lower right, you see there's a brown hose that's just clearly saw cut, and it's not separated in any fashion that resembles something that would have happened at the bottom of the ocean.
It's incredible.
And nonetheless, they were willing to make that claim, which is absolutely beyond all description. I think that they didn't expect that people would be looking at it this closely, I suppose. If you go back a page, you see, are you on page 23?
I am. The propellers
Again, we
are
see
completely
that
different.
underwater engine picture, and we can see from that picture that the propeller blade was not turning as it hit the water. That is, it was probably stopped, and the three-bladed propeller's lowest blade was probably facing pretty much straight down, and it was severely bent back. As you can see, it's almost contacting, if not contacting, the nose gear strut. And that shows a tremendous amount of force, a differential force that the upper right propeller blade did not experience. Then that would have been reasonable, because it would have first hit the lower one and slowed down before the water overtook the upper propeller blade. So it was reasonable for that propeller blade to be bent back. But the question of this particular meme frame is, which of the propeller blades at right is that severely bent rearward propeller blade at left? Well,
none of them look like it.
None of them. And once you have a severely bent and differentially bent, I would add, propeller blade as that one is, it doesn't become unbent. There aren't, just as it rolls back and forth on the ocean floor, it doesn't unbend in a way that then represents any of those propeller blades at right. And the propeller blades at right is one of the two pictures in the entire NTSB report that shows the blades. And the only other one there is actually, in 25. I thought I had a better one than that, but 20. We'll say 25. There's a picture there of the propeller blade that the NTSB report shows, And I've got in that picture on 25 at left in the bigger picture, juxtaposed against the lower picture of the NTSB picture, which has a fairly thin black stripe. We have other pictures from other media that show what was really on that engine, and that's what I labeled there, real versus NTSB. Now, if you look back 2 frames, we saw that the underwater blade had a fairly thin black stripe, but that is indeed what the NTSB picture has. But if we look at right on page 25, there are 3 pictures there from other media which show the wider black stripe was what was on that engine on the salvage barge, which can only mean that the NTSB or someone messing with their pictures, photoshopping and so forth, changed that image so it would appear to be the same as the underwater picture.
Right. Well, also I noticed that the black line is, I mean, it's not parallel to that white line.
That's exactly right.
It looks
exactly
as if
right
someone painted it on manually.
Yeah, painted manually. Exactly right. And we have them a number of ways, which shows that they were literally falsifying the evidence in this scenario, which is absolutely incredible. And there are actually other evidences of the NTSB or whoever messed with their evidence were falsifying other evidence in this scenario. One of which is that image at the upper left of 25. That is, we're looking at the back of the engine there, and there's a double exposure just of that area. And you see several things just there which are double exposed right next to one another. But the rest of the image is not double exposed. So someone was obviously messing with that. And why would they do that? Well, if we go back to those other pictures which show the saw cuts, we would not see those saw cuts very well if we had only their double exposed back view of that engine to look at. But we were fortunate through other media to get images which were far better of that backside of the engine, so we can see what really happened there. And just I'll point out on page 24, the upper left, there's 2 small inset pictures. There are very heavy mount struts there of significant girth and so forth, a thickness that exhibit having been, we'll call the jaws of life, kind of pinching and cutting, which must have been a huge effort for somebody at one point. That is not something that wobbled back and forth through the waves at the ocean floor. And where this would have been, by the way, as the salver represented, it was just 200 to 300 yards from shore, which would not have had this kind of extreme wave action, even though they said that. I mean, it was only like 25 feet, 30 feet, which we have, in fact, the bathymetry map, which shows that the deepest place there would have been about 17.5 meters deep. So that's, it would not have had that kind of thing going on. But even if it did have very extreme wave action going on underneath the water, the kind of separation that we see on those mounts is not by any means related to some big storm or rolling around on the rocks. So
no, and I also want to call attention to the point at which you show that the special non-shearing bolts have been manually removed.
Yes, yeah. Those are indeed special bolts that you have on an airplane, or this particular one at least, such that if there were some big force coming to take the nose gear out, that it would not simply snap. The special non-shearing bolts were meant to stretch and stretch and it would take an incredible amount of force, and they would not snap. That is a feature of those particular bolts. They do not snap off. So we need to see, even if they ultimately would have broken, they would have stretched those bolts throughout the range of the force that would ever have applied to it. But we saw that was, in the underwater picture, that nose gear was just fine right there.
Yeah.
So there was no possible way that enough force could have been brought to bear on the nose gear at that point. And even if there were an extreme amount of force, it would have stayed there as bent bolts that finally would have given way. But they're just gone. And one of the things I requested from the NTSB was the equipment or the material that they salvaged. What was it? Did they get the nose gear? Was it in there somewhere? Because we conjecture that, well, since there were two engines, there's plenty of evidence to show that there were two engines, they probably would have been reusing that nose gear. But anyway, they did not give me answer on that. They would not forward the Foia response for that, even though they acknowledged my request.
Really?
So,
wow.
Yeah. So what was of interest, of course, is all of that is chain of custody documents. So we would have known who would have handled all of that, as well as what material was involved. So we don't have that. And similarly, I requested all the chain of custody documents for the pictures. And if we had that, we would probably know who was, if the documents weren't falsified, we'd know who was responsible to have made whatever changes to those documents. But that was not also forthcoming from the NTSB. But I believe we ultimately will get that information. I can only hope that it's just not falsified, or we can ask down the line how that happened.
Now,
but
have you
yes.
submitted? Well, I'm sorry. I should ask. When did you submit those FOIA requests? Was that during the former administration, or has that been since President Trump?
Yeah, there were, I think, in total 3 different FOIA requests that went unanswered, and I was told that it was just being held by the investigator in charge, and as soon as he approved it, I would get it. But that never happened, and it was all under the previous administration, yes.
Well, I would certainly be interested to see if you would get any different responses now that hopefully it's a whole different change of leadership over there.
Well, that's one of the features of this whole exercise, that is, at this level, the same people are still there. Mm. So these people's jobs and potential for criminal indictment is still very much the case.
Okay.
So I'm sure they're not any more interested now just because a different person is in charge.
Right.
And it may well come to a time where there's someone who can set the people down and ask them the right questions on the basis of the fact that we have a different person in charge. But at the moment, this is so pervasive, and we need to consider that is, all of these agencies being involved. We have not mounted this effort that it will take to get behind this. And I hope and pray that at one point we can mount that effort. But it's going to be a huge effort, and we'll have to be interviewing lots of people among the clowns, and lots of people among the NTSB, and lots of people among the FAA, and lots of people among the U.S. Coast Guard. So, I'll raise my hand for that to volunteer, but I don't do that. That's, it's going to require a commitment to get behind this. And there are other commitments that also deserve to be gotten behind. So we'll see what's possible. Okay. But certainly we want to drain the swamp, and we don't want these people who have shown themselves to be very corruptible to be involved in our future here. What we're talking about can change, it can sway billions and billions of dollars, and the success or demise of huge companies that are involved in aviation with our government. be it GE Aviation, Pratt and Whitney Canada, all kinds of Boeing, Cessna, blah, 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 right on down the line. If the NTSB is corrupt, they can make whatever they want to happen.
Yeah.
And we just can't live under that kind of circumstance. What we have is, the result of corruption. And I think we've determined we don't want that.
Yes.
And we want to be rid of the people who have shown themselves to be corruptible. And that's by no means the case at the moment. And we saw that. I mean, for this particular exercise, how it was glossed over. That is, the first White House press conference of 2018, an NBC White House correspondent asked a very convoluted question, basically saying, this previous FAA administrator, Michael Huerta, has done such a great job. In fact, there haven't been any airline deaths since 2009. Isn't he doing such a wonderful job? Doesn't the president want to reinstate him for another term? And this was literal, in-your-face request, demand for payback.
Yeah.
For someone who had covered up this, that was participating in this, that was in your face. And thankfully, he did not get renewed. He was replaced. That was the kind of gutsy move that it took from President Donald Trump at that point. And that needs to be repeated again and again. And it has been repeated in many places.
Yes.
But even though the top dog might have had to go somewhere else, there was certainly no indictment. There was no removal of his pension or anything like that, which is a due process that we all deserve. Mm-hmm. No one can be simply accused or whatever, and things like that happen. However, there's evidence for these things. And one of those things, another, is what his number two did and is still standing there, that is, still has office. The number two in the FAA is the one who saw to the destruction of evidence in this particular case and went from roughly number 32 in the organization to number 2. That's corruption at work, yes, in my opinion. And that we haven't fixed at all. Yeah. It needs to be fixed.
One of the toughest things about that is the administrative, branch of the government. It is enormous. It employs so many people, and the corruption is so endemic through each department that we have. If you were to clear it out all at once, the government would essentially collapse. We would basically have, so many empty positions in such a power vacuum. I don't know if it's possible to do it in a quick fashion. It must be done slowly over time. And even then, replacing the leadership, as you say, you've got many, underlings throughout each organization, that have had their fingers in a lot of different pies and have been corrupted in many, many different ways.
It's a tremendous effort that lies ahead of us, but I don't think we can shirk it.
No.
I don't think we can sweep it under the rug. Since they didn't fix it in 2013 here, they had to experience a lot of that in 2016 with the Russia-Trump collusion exercise. Yep. And note that all those people would have looked back and said, well, my friends who did that and back in 2013, none of those had to pay a price. Mm-hmm. I know who's going to win this argument, and I'll be on the side that wins. They should always, they should know who wins. That is, the right should always win. Right. And then if the story redounds with that information, then they will make the right choices too. That is, they won't view that corruption has succeeded and that they should be on the side of corruption to go forward. Right. It certainly has lined a lot of people's pockets. It's helped them professionally. So they've learned how to see crime pay. Yep. And we have to change that story. And it's getting behind that and the hysteresis of that curve is daunting, of course, but we have to dedicate ourselves to it. And we should hope that it would not be simply a destructive thing. There are 47,000 people in the FAA. I think if 2,000 corrupt ones were identified and they left, we'd still have enough that the place wouldn't necessarily collapse.
Right.
So right. I think things like that are true as well, that there are people, good people with good efforts who can be put in those positions to carry on. So we needn't fear that if we get rid of corrupt people, that somehow that's going to be a bad thing in any way.
No, I don't mean to imply that. I just mean that in order to do it so that we maintain a stability, it just needs to be done over a period of time. And frankly, I think that there's a lot of things happening, a lot of people that may have been replaced that we just don't necessarily hear about in the public. But I mean, I didn't know that the FAA employed 47,000 people specifically. So I mean, is it only 2,000 that would be corrupt? I mean, it's very possible that it's quite a few more than that. But if they did go through and do like a major house cleaning, then that might send the right message that corruption is no longer tolerated in the U.S. government, and and then those people that are left, would by proxy end up deciding to do the right thing.
Yeah, and the whistleblowers getting proper treatment there is also a part of that.
Yep.
A lot of these people maybe saw corrupt things going on, didn't participate in it, other than to keep their mouths shut, such that we probably can't indict them. People keeping their mouths shut, it's hard to indict people like that. But next time around when they see it, if they can be encouraged to play the role of whistleblower and to make sure that corruption doesn't blossom fully, that's worth something. That's very important.
Certainly.
Anyway, we can move on. Maybe on page 20 of those memes, I've just summarized some things from various agencies that were involved in this, and there are some bullet points that that show things they did. For example, records under the FAA that were required to be kept for 5 years. Were confirmed in writing to have been destroyed within 7 months of the crash, using faulty logic and false justification. That is, the policies were pretty clear, but the justification and the logic used by the representatives and the administrative judge in that case was completely false and relied on policies that were totally convoluted and inappropriate. Now, that would have to be done through a legal process as well to determine all of that, to indict anyone, but it's definitely cut and dried what was done. And I mean, it is a message that all FAA people have, that is, you don't destroy evidence, you don't destroy records. These things are required to be kept for lengths of time and certain criteria to be met. And it's clearly an outlier and a corrupted process to have seen those records be deleted. And the claim was that those records weren't even kept from the beginning, which is also very much against policy, and it wouldn't have been what any of the employees would have been doing at the time, unless they were explicitly told in a very corrupt fashion, which they would have recognized. So.
Right.
But those people haven't come forward either. But anyway, all of that needs to be sorted out through a process that is still doable in my understanding. And I've been encouraged with that. All these things that are related to the research of this book, particularly with regard to aviation, has been vetted by lots of people in positions that very much know. Senior FAA people, retired NTSB investigators, things like that. We're not just hypothesizing and theorizing about possible conspiracies and so forth. We have clear evidence for all these things, and it just needs to be recognized as important enough that they represent things that we need to address to have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. If we don't care about that, yeah, it can be let go. But I think we need to care about that particular thing. And this is one of the big areas. It's not just an outlier in the back hallway here. What we've got here is an assemblage of all the top dogs, people like Brennan, people like Obama himself, people like his closest advisors involved in this particular scenario, people who, like Fuddy, who would have been very closely known to Barry. I'll say that in belabored term. It's clear from everyone's actions that they were treating this as no expense spared. That is, they were going to do this one way or another to the fullest extent they could. They went so far over the top with resources, with commitment, with people from even likely foreign military groups. And there's one of the keys, that is, it's like we're a banana republic or something from Central America.
Yeah.
That is, to overthrow election results, to put someone who is not qualified as if they were qualified in charge, and to keep them in charge, and to keep the truth of all those things hidden. All of that was done through use of our military and our most classified tools and gear of our, for example, our SEALs, who had these gear at their disposal normally, and it was diverted for these election fraud purposes. That's the core of even the worst of what we're talking about with Trump-Russia collusion. That was imagined. This is real. This really happened. And they pulled out all the stops to make it happen. The top dogs did this, not just some Peter Strzok or McCabe. No, these were the top people. And I'm not saying the top people weren't involved in those others, but we have very clear proof about all of these people doing this. And it was obvious for what reason. That is, to paint a usurper, someone who's not qualified, as someone who is qualified, and to hide all of the aspects and the people who were involved that let that happen, that made it appear it was correct. And we have the people showing themselves with falsified evidence. The NTSB, there are several other pieces of evidence that we clearly know they falsified. And it's proof, bottom line proof. So these things, we hope someone will find sufficiently valuable to look at and to get behind and to clean out this corruption and make sure it never happens again. Because the tools of our military, the classified tools, were used and able to be used. You know, that should never happen. And I can't even say that in any weighty enough way. Can't emphasize that enough. If the tools of our military are able to be used to change the election results, which is the bottom line. Election results in 2012 were changed and further covered up in 2013, such that 2016's elections, which should have been obvious that we had a usurper in charge who falsified all kinds of things, and all the truth of that would have been even clearer than Hillary's bleach-bitted emails, that therefore we would vote those people out of office. They would never get in again. But we came to that election and it was razor thin, almost could have gone the other way. And even though I would say, for example, that Hillary's crowds of 50 and 60 at a time should have told us that she wasn't particularly popular. How is this even possible that she's able to mount an effort that appears like it could possibly win? Everyone was saying it. And we know all that was fake news and so forth.
Now, you know,
bought news.
I knew I knew that there was no way that Hillary was going to win. I mean, like you said, you look at the crowds, and, you know, for Donald Trump, he's overflowing these stadiums, you know, these venues. Hillary Clinton could barely fill up a local civic center. You know, she's speaking in a public library, and there's plenty of room to sit down. The only people who were telling us that Hillary was going to win was the mainstream media. The fake polls that they were providing, telling us that she was going to win in a landslide. That was probably one of the most satisfying things for me on election night in 2016, because I went in and I just knew it. I had a feeling in my gut Donald Trump was going to win. And to watch the returns come in and the faces of the mainstream media anchors just fall, and then for Hillary to not come out and give a concession speech, and all of those people that had been waiting all night for her, John Podesta comes walking out with his hands all sweaty and clinging and wringing them, and everybody just fell apart. It was glorious.
Yeah, I relish that moment too. There's two things there. One, I quickly will credit God. God made that happen, in my opinion.
Yes, he did.
But beyond that, I think the corruptocrats, Hillary and all these people, and James Comey, literally created the support for Donald Trump. I mean, he had his own capabilities and so forth. He was obviously no empty suit like the predecessor. But, you know, he had a few negatives that people were harping on left and right, of course, and there was some truth for that in terms of whether you might want him as a husband or something. But the long and the short is they were creating the desire for Donald Trump by their corruption, by the false statements they were making, by the things that people were listening to closely and could see through. They said, we don't want those corrupt Clintons involved in our next government. And our alternative there is someone who will champion our effort for we the people. And Donald Trump was really certainly the best standard bearer for that thought, and maybe even the only standard bearer who had any credibility to possibly mount a victory over what seemed an inevitably powerful machine. And so that was hugely important. And it was that corruption, I think, that allowed Donald Trump to build his campaign. So if they had played a straight up game, if there hadn't been 50 people dropping dead right around the Clintons all the time, that kind of thing, they could have won rather easily, I should think. But there was just so much corruption in the Barry years that people knew there were problems that they didn't want to see in their future government. So I think that helped a lot.
Amen.
Yeah. One of the things I haven't really mentioned at all is Hollywood. And I think that's in plate 18 and 19 maybe, 18 for sure. That is, the owner of the commuter airline that was involved with this crash, that is the Cessna Grand Caravan, was owned by a group in Hawaii, Pkwy. They were Hollywood connected. That is, both the owner and a pilot that was also involved in this scenario, the person we know as the first on the scene pilot, both of those were Hollywood stunt pilots. They flew helicopters, and of course they can fly other planes too. The first on the scene pilot was flying ostensibly with his girlfriend in a small, I've forgotten the name, Grumman Cheetah aircraft. And he made representations about that were obviously not correct. And both of them came from this Hollywood background to make things appear real when they weren't. And they did so for two main television programs, Hawaii Five-0 and Lost. And they were very active in those particular Hollywood productions. And they participated by their good efforts, their aerial work and the setup for various things, to allow this to appear real. And part of that they did by setup, choosing the place, by representations that they made which were not correct. which is too much to go into at this point. But the long and the short is Hollywood is participating in this. Mm-hmm. And there are things that are said, disinformation. One of the features of the owner of Pkwy, Schumann Air, was that there were false representations made. There were all kinds of disinformation being sprinkled about, for example, about how long the pilot had been with that company. He had been there 1 year, the owner said, but actually he'd been there since for several years and was the director of operations. So, and the timing of the accident, or the crash, if you will, were represented to have occurred at various times, at 4 different times. And all of that represents disinformation. That is, there's such a broad spectrum of things in the media that anyone who's trying to research it says, well, this person said at such and such a time, that person said at such and such a time. I can't resolve that, or who do we trust, and all this. So you spend your time wasting trying to resolve the conflicts of information within the scenario that came from various supposedly authoritative people. So that is intended to confound people who would come to investigate this, and certainly make the task that much more daunting. And I can say, yes, it did make it more daunting. And for example, the salver, who literally was there hands-on underwater and above water, getting the crash vehicle, says it's 200 to 300 yards from shore. Well, the owner says 400 to 500 yards from shore, or even says, or he says whatever to represent to Hawaii News Now, such that Hawaii News Now says it was a mile offshore and that it was 400 feet deep, if not 1,000 feet deep, at a ledge or a cliff underwater. Well, all of those things were severe disinformation, just meant to confuse the situation and anybody that might follow. But it, for example, gave excuse to the NTSB and the FAA such that they didn't secure the crash site. And if they thought, well, if it's 400 to 1,000 feet underwater, maybe a mile off the shore, they don't have the resources in any short time to do anything about that. That is, they can't secure a large area miles wide, hundreds of feet deep for this. But when they don't secure an area, it means there's a potential for evidence to be messed with. People to come in, divers, for example, and change the evidence. And that's precisely what happened. Divers did come in and visit the crash site while it was not secured. And the things they did, well, we only know by a couple of things, that is, representations. Indeed, they were there, but it's not to suggest that they told us everything they did. Things disappeared, like there was lots of money. One of the passengers' wives had a wallet, she said, or he said on her behalf, the husband said on her behalf, with lots of money. Well, that never came out in the public news, and there was an insurance company that was paying people off and replacing like computers and diamond rings, and one can surmise this amount of money and so forth. All of these passengers were compensated. They were paid. And I believe these missing items were also compensated. So how do we know, how does anyone know that evidence wasn't tampered with? That some diver who came by actually took those things and was participating to falsify the scenario in some way. So when the FAA and the NTSB have only misrepresentations to work with, and we know, for example, they were misrepresentations because the pilot certainly knew where the airplane lay, and the representation where the salver picked up the airplane was precisely the same as where it went down. So, you know, it's hard to say that it was washed a mile and a half out to sea, which is involved in some of the other representations. Like one of the other passengers, who was a former Green Beret, says he swam, and there are also varying accounts, but up to 1.5 miles to shore, which took him up to 90 minutes, or 90 minutes thereabouts. Well, no, it's hard to have to swim 90 minutes or 1.5 miles when the crash site is just 234 yards offshore.
It's not very far.
It's not very far. And furthermore, we have the video of him starting to swim to shore and making it to shore. And we have the timestamps from the Maui County Fire Department for all of that. And it took him 6.5 minutes. Hello? Hello?
Oh my gosh.
Is that disinformation or what?
Yeah.
Or does somebody who's a former Green Beret know all about disinformation?
Yeah.
Who would have been trained in that aspect? The owner of the airline was also an Army guy, an Army officer, I understand. So these are people who know all about that kind of thing.
Would that be Richard Schumann or Josh Lang?
Gustav Richard Schumann is the owner. And I believe he was an Army...
former Army officer. Yeah.
Former Army officer. So he was also one of those who was a helicopter pilot, stunt pilot. And we saw in one of those frames there, he was with the helicopter and so forth. So there's a lot of that in the book, so you could get more from that.
Excellent.
But let's see, where should I go? We should talk about the pilot having made lots of misrepresentations. The pilot, for example, told the FAA that he was rounding the turn to Honolulu when the engine had this catastrophic engine failure. That was at supposedly 300 feet. Mm-hmm. That's what he told the FAA. Now, when he wrote his written deposition to the NTSB, he said he was crossing 500 feet AGL, that's above ground level, when this failure occurred, the engine failure occurred. And that's depicted there in the upper right of number 3. And we see the X marks the spot, if you will, of rounding the turn to Honolulu. So in 2 different representations, he says it was either 300 feet or 500 feet. And that represents a turn then of, I believe it's approximately 120 degrees in 300 to 500 feet. Well, commuter airline pilots are certainly trained, and they have a requirement from their from the FSDO, the Flight Standards District Office that governs commuter airlines, for takeoff profiles. And that generally, in almost every circumstance, will not allow for any turns from the runway heading below 500 feet. So to have turned 120 degrees within 300 feet from the ground is essentially stunt pilot aerobatics, highly actionable, frankly. FSDO, where I have my little shop, I'm a flight instructor. If you do a thing like that, you will be called on the carpet for sure, and you may well lose your certificate for having done something like that, certainly for admitting that you did it on paper.
And that's this first turn here. So we start with the beginning of the line to the bottom left of the frame. It goes off along the runway, and then that very first turn there, that's the turn that you're saying?
Yeah, that's approximately 120 degrees of turn.
Okay.
And if you say that's where the failure happened, which it didn't happen before that because we have video of that entire stretch. If you say you're turning 120 degrees within 300 feet from the ground, you are definitely turning immediately as you lift off from the ground, right, and turning very close to the ground in what they would call a hazardous, irresponsible, reckless fashion, which would be certificate action material anywhere in the country by the FAA. Okay. But they never even questioned that in the NTSB report, never questioned it in the FAA report. Is highly suspect. I mean, when people do bad things, things that are known by everybody to be reckless and dangerous, to just gloss over that. When somebody dies in a commuter airline accident, no, you get very suspicious. It's like, Joseph Mifsud. Mm-hmm. He lies 3 times to the government, and it's very clearly documented. Why isn't he punished? Well, yeah, why wouldn't he be punished? Because they're all in on it.
Yep.
He's an operative.
So from this diagram, he makes this tight turn, and does he continue around to this blue line, or does he follow the heading of the red line?
Well, that's a very good question. At the red X, which we have video for, mm-hmm. and we have the video for the descent to the water. What happened is the videographer represents that just before the catastrophic engine failure, or just before it happened, he turned his camera off. The catastrophic engine failure supposedly happens, and then within just a few seconds, he turns it back on, and he kept it until the batteries ran out. He kept it rolling. Well, so that means the red X is approximately where the first portion of the video ends.
Okay.
And so we know where the touchdown point on the water is, and that's at the end of that blue stripe, blue segment with the arrows, blue arrows. There's a little orange D. Can you see that?
Yep, I can see that. Yep.
Okay. That's what would have happened. That's a representation of what did happen. That is, on a powerless glide, the pilot put it down on the water. Mm-hmm. So there's, if he can't make the runway, which he would have, any pilot would try if they could, we'll put it that way.
Right. Because
it's the safest place to be. Mm-hmm. Certainly a lot safer than putting it on the winds and the waves. Downwind especially, the wind was coming from the right there, from the east. So he had effectively 15 knots of tailwind, which would have increased his hit on the water by 15 knots. And by comparison, if he were able to put it on the water upwind, it would be a differential of 30 knots. That is, if he were able to put it on the water into the wind, he would be going 15 knots slower that way. Mm-hmm. But comparison with 15 knots tailwind is a differential of 30 knots in total. So a pilot such as experienced as he was, we had 18,000 hours of pilot experience, he would know how to do that. That's to put it mildly. A qualified person flying this plane with 1,000 hours would well know to do that. But the long and the short is, when the videographer turns his camera back on, we know where he is. He's roughly at that orange arc semicircle on the left side. Okay. That is, the red line shows that there's a whole lot of video or time unaccounted for. And it means a displacement both in altitude. There's 750 feet in altitude lost. And there's a distance there of roughly 3/4 of a mile. Okay. And yet the videographer represented that there was just a few seconds from the turning off the camera to this failure, and a few more seconds maybe, so a total of 5 or 6 or 7 seconds, and yet somehow that distance is traversed, which would have been easily 2-3 minutes maybe, maybe as little, we'll say, if he really raced through that, we'll say at least 40 seconds. But the bigger thing is, why do that displacement? Why would you go that direction out to sea when you had the alternative of using that distance to go to the runway? Right. There's no sense whatsoever to that. So how do we know that that place is, well, there's a piece I'm leaving out here. Okay. If you look at the upper left 2 pictures, we see in the video that exists and was supplied by the NTSB that it is neither 300 feet or 500 feet that the pilot flew his plane, but when he was at the Red X, but he did not make a turn from runway heading before he was well above 500 feet. So the whole 300 to 500 feet is a total lie. And once he began starting his turn, which was well above 500 feet, he turned another 28 seconds in his climb. So he was legitimately over 1,000 feet to 1,500 feet. And that's precisely, verbatim, the words that appear on two of the passengers' lips in news reports subsequent to all of the brouhaha much later. So how is it that the passengers, who are presumably not pilots, how could they have the correct information verified by the video that the pilot doesn't have? Well, it's because the pilot is telling things that aren't true.
Yeah.
He knows an 18,000-hour pilot, I would say, can't make mistakes like this, can't make 120 degrees of turn below 300 feet. He can't. It's so ingrained to do the right thing, to have done the right thing 12,000 times already. You don't do the wrong thing with safety. So anyway, I think it just confirms the ruse. It confirms that the pilot is willing to say things that just weren't true, left, right, up and down. And he probably told the passengers the right scoop. He told them, we were somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 feet. And that's what they repeat. Well, yeah. Why doesn't he repeat that to the FAA or NTSB? Well, because he's constructing a scenario that didn't really happen to make the official narrative here. And he knows he's going to get away with it. He knows he's going to not be questioned about it because everyone's in on it. Hello. Anyway.
Yeah, makes sense to me.
Yeah, if we go backwards a little bit from page 3 there to number 1, we see the direction. Well, this is the break between the two segments of video. This is the videographer, and the one on the left is the end of the first part, and the right one is at the beginning of the second part. And somehow the direction of the sun's rays have changed well over 100 degrees. And they're coming in at you can see they're coming into the airplane at his right shoulder there, where at the end of the first, and they presumably would have done roughly a continuation of that turn. So it would have only been a few degrees, 20 degrees, 30 or maybe, but no, somehow we are well over 100 degrees different, and the sun's rays are coming in a very different angle. Well, that's because of this relocation where he's now at the beginning of the second part of the video, he's at roughly 250 feet above the water. And he's way out to sea, if you will. He's going to make that arc back into the shoreline to be able to put it down purposefully on the water where that capital D is. And we have other evidence that shows this airplane configuration to know that that is very close to correct, if not exact. So the pilot is making misrepresentations. One of the things he does, he says is a catastrophic engine failure, and that the engine stopped. Both he, in representation to the NTSB, and his lawyer elsewhere says the engine stopped. Well, we have video of the instrument panel, which is there in the middle of number 3, middle left. Those engine gauges we can read to some extent, and we see that the fuel flow is a nice idling fuel flow of a smoothly running engine. And in fact, that's what the audio confirms, that it was a smoothly running engine after he says he had a catastrophic engine failure and the fire warning horn was going off. Elsewhere we're going to hear that the fan blades were all broken, and essentially the engine was chewed up and eating itself, and it was complete. There was a fire within the engine. It was said, an extreme fire. Well,
I just want to let you know that we're down to 9 minutes.
the whole segment? 9 minutes? Oh my gosh. So anyway, we see representations like that that are belied by the evidence on the videotape. We see the pilot moving the emergency power lever, for example, in ways that are prohibited by the manual. So that kind of manipulation could well have caused an engine fire. The pilot would have known and been trained not to do that, and the manual says not to do that, but he did it anyway. My theorizing is to suggest maybe he was trying to recreate the sabotage that was already done to the other engine, which was in fact the engine that was registered to be with that aircraft. But anyway, the pilot manipulations are clearly of a skill level that are not his. That is, he would not do that as a professional pilot with his skill level. He would know not to contravene the pilot operating handbook in the ways that he does. But the things that the passengers say about what happened as well is orchestrated. It's amazingly harmonious. They say the same things with almost the exact same phrase, and yet they're false. They say that the pilot says that everyone's supposed to don a life jacket before they exit the airplane, and almost nobody is wearing a life jacket as they exit the airplane. And the pilot says he told everyone to stay away from the airplane lest it sink and pull them down with it, and everybody's hanging on to the airplane. And so these are contradictions that just it make the pilot appear that he's Rodney Dangerfield and he can't get any respect from anybody to do what he says to do. Well, the long and the short is they didn't need to believe and do whatever because they were being protected in this scenario by military trained divers who were all over the place, ready there to help them or save them if they should, whatever. But the long and the short is there's good evidence that they were able to stand at various places in the scenario. And it was not that deep at all. In fact, there's the bathymetry map on plate number 6 shows that just next to the capital D near the shoreline is an area that's marked off above it as 1 meter deep. And there's a little asterisk. There are several asterisks there along the shoreline. The asterisk means that there are portions of the ocean floor protruding above the water, depending on the tides. Hello. And the maximum depth in that area, well, that line that demarcates the outer bound is already just 4.25 meters. So like 17 feet is the maximum depth at that line. That's the average depth at that line. So everything closer to shore might well be a lot more shallow than that. And we have imagery. Let me try to find it. There it is on number 7. That is, there's a depiction on number 7 at the right of the aircraft where it went down. And we see those white capped kind of area along from the aircraft nose to the shore, for example. That's, I believe, that area where there are protrusions from underwater at low tide. Now, when the aircraft crashed, it was not the lowest tide, so that you might not have seen that way. And we don't see it in the pictures, but it means that just below the surface there would have been those protrusions from the ocean floor. But on plate 7, you see those darker blue areas near the top. And those are underwater lagoons where at the edge of them you perhaps could have stood. And we think we have pictures of the passengers, various passengers, standing along the edge of those or standing where the aircraft went down.
It sure looks like it.
And it's a lot like the inset pictures there at the left, which is from another incident where people are shown at left apparently struggling with their life jackets, but at right you see that there are people able to stand right up and really be in no danger whatsoever.
Okay.
So that's the kind of scenario we're looking at. And these underwater lagoons afforded people the opportunity to just hop off the ledge of that underwater lagoon and then do their treading water or do the things that the might need to for various portions of the video, and then hop right back on the ledge again to do other portions. Number 15 has one where the director or the assistant director, deputy director, is seen there standing, and he has almost none of his life jacket into the water. And supposedly this is where Fuddy is struggling and so forth, unable to get oxygen and becoming very stressed and so forth. But by the way he's standing, and the difference between when he is in the water, treading water, or has his life jacket onto the water, you can see he's not standing, not able to stand, or at least bend his legs at the time. Anyway, there's that difference that you see in various places. So you can see that at the lower left of 15, the deputy director at lower left has most of his life jacket onto the water. So when he at the upper portion there has just 10% of his life jacket touching the water, he's clearly not resting on that life jacket.
No, that's a definite. Well, listen, Hugo, we are at 10:58. Well, I mean, 2 hours. Yeah, 1 hour and 58 minutes. Was there any last portion of this that you really want the audience to know before we sign off? And
well, I think we have clearly evidence that what the passengers have told is poppycock, and that's kind of the theme. That is, there are diver gear, there's U.S. military gear in these video frames that show that this was a clandestine exercise, must have been planned ahead, and involved our military, as testified, as verified by people who would know, people in that scenario, who have said this is the military being used for election fraud purposes, to cover up what Fuddy did in authenticating a false and forged birth certificate from Barry. That's what makes this an extremely important event. It literally changed the 2012 election. It was set to change the 2016 election, but for the hand of God and Donald Trump's popularity and our willingness, our desire to have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, that's what changed things here. And we should go forward on the trajectory of fixing all of that, which is eliminating these corrupt people from our government, draining the swamp, and moving on to the things that we need to do as a proper government constitutionally.
Excellent. And I just want to remind everyone, if you enjoyed learning this information about what happened to Loretta Fuddy and you want to learn more, by all means, please visit thefuddyhoax.com, where you can purchase a copy of the book yourself. It will have a ton of additional information, many, many more things that we were unable to get into tonight or in the first portion of our program. However, if you just want to, dip your toes in a little bit more, you can always download the meme booklet that we were looking at tonight. That is going to be linked in the description of this video below. I just want to thank Hugo for coming and sharing this information with us tonight. Hugo, this is an incredible story. Clearly, something happened here, and it is not what they are telling us. So just thank you so much for being here, Hugo, and I hope that we can have you back again in the future.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right, sir. Thank you, and we'll talk to you soon.
Very good.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And once again, thank you to Hugo for sharing all this information. I just want to say once again, guys, you can download this meme booklet for free. There is a link in the description below. There is a ton of information regarding the discrepancies that we discussed here tonight and even more. And as I stated earlier with Hugo, there is so much information and, even theories about what potentially could have happened to Loretta Fuddy. And you can get that information by going to thefuddyhoax.com and downloading the book for yourself. Please remember that it's always great when you guys support my guests. This is a lot of information. Hugo did a really good job putting it together. Also, if you'd like to support the show, there are always donation links in the description below. I've got PayPal, I've got Bitcoin, I've got other cryptocurrencies, I've got the Cash App. And for anyone tonight who gave super chats, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. Well, as always, guys, this has been Red Pill 78. I am the Corruption Detector, and this was your Red Pill News for Saturday Night Livestream. Good luck, everyone, and God bless.